You didn't make that bad call because you were tired, but because your decision system had already broken down. And the really uncomfortable bit, you felt completely fine when you made it. And that's what we're talking about today. Not tiredness or burnout, but something very more specific, and also something that you can actually do something about. So let me paint a picture of a fairly ordinary day for many of us. In the morning, you're really sharp, you're asking the right questions, and you push back on something that doesn't quite add up for you. You're doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing. By mid-morning, something has slightly shifted. It's subtle, you're still functioning, you're productive, but you've started to default to whatever is already in motion rather than actually reevaluating it. And by early afternoon, you had something sweet, you say yes to something, not because it's right, but because constructing the alternative would take more bandwidth than your brain has left. And late afternoon, you're approving, agreeing, avoiding. And the version of you that would have paused at 9 a.m. doesn't pause. And here's the thing, you don't feel impaired. You feel like you're still deciding, but you're not. You've shifted to a completely different mode. And that mode has a very different relationship with accuracy. Now, most of us, when we hear decision fatigue, we think about the number of decisions, like as if we had a counter in our brain. And once you've hit a certain number, the system breaks down, and that is not how it works. The research is quite clear on this. Decision fatigue is driven by decision complexity, emotional weight, and the total cognitive load of your environment. Pignatiello, Martin, and Hickman laid this out in their 2020 conceptual analysis. And it's a depletion of cognitive and self-regulatory resources, not a count of choices. So a day with 200 low-stakes micro choices might drain you less than a morning with 3 really high conflict and really ambiguous calls that you need to make. The weight matters and the emotional cost that it costs you. And of course, your environment, I talk about that a lot. And that's where what research actually shows, this is the part that changes how you read your own performance. Your system doesn't slow down, it doesn't get noisier or less confident, it quietly changes strategy. Your brain doesn't tell you it's struggling, it just starts deciding differently, faster, simpler, more shaped by what's already in front of you. And you experience that as normal. Me too, of course. And it's just how things feel at the end of a long day. So the question isn't whether you made decisions today. It's at what point did you actually really stop deciding? And that's what we're going to get into. And I'm going to give you 2 specific things you can do about it. And neither of them involve a phone, an app, or any kind of weird structured relaxation technique. I'm really not into that. So 3 things at the end of this video. First, what decision fatigue really is and why calling it tiredness is a wrong frame for us. And second, what happens in your brain and in your behavior when your system degrades. And I'm going to share one finding from research that I still find generally unsettling. And third, what sleep actually does to your decision capacity and the thinking method I use personally to track it. And then 2 practical methods. So the prefrontal cortex, this is the part of the brain that handles the cognitive work most of us associate with good decision making, evaluating and inhibition and weighing up competing options. And of course, overriding a first instinct when it's wrong. But under sustained load, its activation reduces. And I would like to be clear, that's not a metaphor, that's a very measurable neural change. Stuart, Loy, and Chip published research on this in 2025, looking specifically at the neurobiology of cognitive fatigue. And what they found was exactly this: reduced prefrontal engagement under sustained cognitive demand. And when that happens, our brain shifts, not to nothing because that would be too obvious, it shifts to heuristic processing, meaning pattern matching shortcuts that feel like decisions but actually aren't. There's also a dopaminergic component here, and I would like to explain this more practical rather than just go into the pop science. And so bear with me, even though it might feel a little tough, but it's important to know those things. So as load accumulates across the day, the brain's effort-reward calculation, it shifts. High-effort decisions start to feel more costly, so the system, without any conscious input from you, starts avoiding them. Zenon Deves and Olivier demonstrated this in 2016. Dopaminergic systems directly modulate the willingness to engage with effortful decisions. When the system is taxed, effort avoidance increases. And this is exactly why saying yes feels so much easier than saying no by late afternoon. Saying no requires justification, evaluation, and it requires us to construct an alternative. Saying yes almost requires nothing. So the system takes the path of least resistance, and it does it so smoothly that we don't notice the shift has happened. I'm Gwen Bach, and I have a master's degree in applied neuroscience, and I'm the founder of Applied Brain Lab, where I study how modern environments shape decision-making in ambitious professionals and business owners. And what I keep on coming back to across the research and in people that I work with is this: the moment the system degrades is almost never the moment that we think it does. It's more subtle than that and very gradual, and it comes from the inside, and it looks like a perfectly normal afternoon. So when your evaluative system is running at full capacity, it does something really important. It corrects for bias. And so it catches, say, the anchoring effect. It notices when you're overweighing the first option, and it pulls back from the availability shortcut, the tendency to reach for whatever comes to mind most easily, rather than what's actually most relevant. Under fatigue, that correction capacity degrades. And I would like to be a little more precise about this. The bias was always there. Fatigue just removes the filter. Vaughan, you showed this in 2019, that fatigue significantly increases susceptibility to the decoy effect, where an irrelevant third option distorts your evaluation on the two that actually matter. Anchoring gets stronger and availability bias gets stronger. Your evaluation becomes more shaped by the framing that you were given than by your own independent analysis. But here's the part that makes this genuinely hard to manage. People under decision fatigue do not reliably feel degraded. And let me tell you about a study that has stayed with me since I first read it. And you've probably heard it, it's quoted a lot. So imagine you're a judge in Israel. You're working through a day of parole hearing. Cases come in sequence, one after the other, and each one is a decision: grant or deny parole. And you believe, as most people in positions of authority, that your decisions are based on facts and the merit of each case, the evidence and risk factors, and of course the legal framework. What Danziger, Lerav, and Avnaim Peso found when they analyzed over 1,000 of these rulings in 2011 was something quite different. At the start of a session, just after a break, judges granted parole in roughly 65% of cases. As the session continued with no break, that rate declined, steadily measurable towards zero. And not because the cases got worse, but because the system got tired. And the default under fatigue in this case is to deny, because denial requires less. It's the path of least resistance. After a break, food, rest, a pause, the rate climbed back to 65% and then steadily declined again. These were experienced judges, people who had spent entire careers making consequential decisions. They had no awareness this pattern existed in their own behavior. And if you'd asked them, they would have told you their decisions were based on the merits. And that is the confidence gap. The distance between how capable you feel and how capable you actually are. And research here suggests the gap widens exactly when it matters most. The two mechanisms I've just described are about what happens during the day. Sleep is about what you bring into it. And poor sleep doesn't just make you feel groggy, it directly impairs prefrontal function. So the same system that we've been talking about, the system responsible for evaluation, inhibition, and of course the correction of bias. Bazazan et al. Found in 2018 that sleep quality is one of the strongest predictors of cognitive performance and fatigue resistance, not just subjective tiredness. Measurable decision capacity. So if your sleep was poor, decision fatigue doesn't start at 4 p.m., it starts at 9 a.m. And you're already beginning the day with a depleted system and then running through it full load. So two things matter here, and they're not the same thing. Sleep length is the obvious one. Below a certain threshold, cognitive performance declines measurably but consistently. But the part most of us miss is that subjective awareness of impairment lags well behind the actual impairment. So you don't feel as bad as you are performing. Sleep consistency is the one that surprises people. Raffaele, and I hope I say his name correctly, et al. Found in 2022 that irregular sleep timing, independent of total duration, disrupts circadian rhythms in ways that affect timing and quality of your cognitive performance windows throughout the day. So you can sleep 7 hours and still not get the performance windows that consistent timing produces, because the body's system that support cognitive function are partly anchored to clock time, not just duration. Shift those anchors around enough and you lose the predictable peak, even if the hours add up. Sleep isn't just recovery from fatigue. It's the condition under which your decision system is rebuilt each night. The first thinking method comes directly from what we know about working memory. Working memory is finite. It holds information in active processing, and it's expensive to run. When you're trying to make a decision, you're asking working memory to do two things at once: hold the structure of the problem and evaluate it. Under load, that dual demand becomes costly. Something gives. Externalizing the decision structure onto paper removes the retention requirement. You're no longer asking the system to hold the problem while also working on it. And the method is very simple. At the start of the day, on paper, you know I like paper, you write down 3 things. 2 or 3 decisions that carry the most consequence for today, and what a good outcome looks like for each of them, and what information you would actually need to make each decision well. And that's it. This is not a framework or planning exercise. It's a written anchor made for when your system is at full capacity. And later in the day, when you're running on reduced resources, you have something external to return to. So you don't have to reconstruct the problem from scratch under the daily load, which is exactly where heuristic shortcuts and bias vulnerabilities are the highest. You're returning to a structure you built up when you were awake and sharp. And you're not making the decision earlier, you're just protecting the conditions under which the decisions get made. Paper only, not a phone or a laptop. Paper keeps the task contained, and it keeps you off screen, and it creates a physical anchor you can return to throughout the day. And I would like to talk about sleep differently, how it usually gets discussed, because most of the conversation around sleep is about habits: to go to bed earlier, to avoid screens, to wind down. And those things, they aren't wrong, but they miss something. The reason sleep is hard to act on is that the consequences are invisible. You wake up at 70% of your decision capacity and you feel like yourself. Nothing here signals the gap. Nothing tells you that today's evaluative window is narrower than you think. You don't have a warning bell. And that's a problem I tried to solve when I started to wear my Whoop about 3 months ago. The Whoop tracks heart rate variability, sleep staging, recovery, and strain across time. And what it did for me, more than anything else, was to make something invisible visible. So take sleep consistency. I always knew duration matters, and I'd read enough on sleep to understand that. But consistency? I hadn't really felt the difference. And my Whoop showed me that I was wrong about that. Nights with the same total hours but irregular timing produced measurably different recovery scores. The pattern was in the data long before I would have noticed it subjectively. And then I had a flu earlier this year, really nasty one. And watching what happened to my recovery scores, my HRV, my sleep staging across those days, it was striking and surprising for me. Not because I didn't know I was ill, but because the data showed me the depth of the physiological disruption in a way my subjective sense of I feel kind of rough today simply doesn't capture. It also showed me how long genuine recovery actually takes, longer than it felt for me. And the one thing that surprised me most was processed food. Sugary, heavily processed food landed me in many red recoveries in a way that was hard to ignore once I'd seen it often enough. Not in a vague sense of feeling worse, but a score, a color, something the Whoop shows you in the app. And something my internal state would have not flagged with anything in that kind of clarity. So what I mean when I say the Whoop makes the invisible visible, it's not that the information wasn't there in my physiology. It was that I had no reliable way to read it. And even as an applied neuroscientist, I know exactly why, because the research tells us that our subjective assessment is of our own cognitive and physical state is one of the least reliable systems that we have. And the Whoop doesn't fix that, but it gives you something external to check it against. And I just love the Whoop. I'm not paid for this. So the Whoop isn't a thinking method. It's the thinking method that you would use awareness to see what is happening. So 2 concrete behaviors. First, consistent sleep and wake times treated as a structural commitment rather than a preference. Not because the number of hours is everything, but because consistency is what produces the predictable cognitive window. And you want to know when you'll be at capacity. Consistency is how you get there. Second, before any day with high consequence decisions, check your recovery state and sequence accordingly. If your system is depleted going on, protect your most important calls for your earliest available window. Do the paper externalization before anything else. The 2 methods reinforce each other. Decision sequencing isn't about working harder in the morning. It's about not burning your highest capacity window on things that don't really need it. And not making your most consequential calls in the worst possible point of your cognitive day. Most people who take their work seriously manage their schedule. They protect time, they block their calendar, and they're careful about where the hours go. But almost nobody manages the decision load inside that schedule. And the cost of not managing it isn't visible in the moment. It's a pattern. Late day defaults, approvals that didn't get the scrutiny they needed, and commitments made because the alternative felt too hard to explain at 4 p.m. And that's not tiredness. That's a brain operating without the conditions it needs to do its job. So here's the reframe I want you to leave with today. Decision fatigue is a resource allocation problem. The resource is cognitive capacity, not hours. And the way you protect it isn't by working less or scheduling better. It's by understanding what depletes the system and what the system does when it's depleted, and building the external structure that keeps your most consequential decisions away from your worst cognitive windows. Most people protect their time. Very few of us protect the systems that make decisions inside that time, and that's the difference.